Are you a New York Yankees fan? Or maybe even a Mets fan? This is Robert Manni, host of Guys Radio, and this week my special guest is Hall of Fame sports writer Bill Madden, who covered the New York Yankees for over 3 decades. He also wrote this amazing book about the greatest Met, Tom Seaver. It all begins on KCAA at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, 102.3, 106.5, FM, 1050 AM here in Southern California. The podcast and my YouTube drop on Thursday. Guys Radio, thanks for your support. Welcome to Guys Radio. I have a very, very special guest, sports writer extraordinaire, Bill Madden. I grew up in River Edge, New Jersey, and I read the New York Daily News for years and years and years, and I always read Bill's column about the Yankees. He's just an amazing writer, a great reporter. He's covered Major League Baseball as a national baseball columnist for the news for more than 40 years, author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller Steinbrenner, which I actually bought for my mother for Christmas one year. And he's collaborated on memoirs about Lou Piniella, Don Zimmer, great Yankees. Bill has been the 2010 recipient of the Baseball Hall of Fame's J.G. Taylor Spink Award and is a member of the Writers Wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He's got a new book about Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life. Welcome to Guys Radio, Bill Madden. Thanks for being here, Bill.
Good to be here.
So let's kind of start. You have a long storied career and you grew up in Oradell, New Jersey, next to neighboring River Edge, where I grew up, and you went to Bergen Catholic. So you were an athlete before you got into sports writing. Is that correct?
I was. I was not a baseball player. Baseball wasn't my sport. I couldn't hit a curveball. I ran track at Bergen Catholic, and I was a 2-time state champion in the 100 and 220.
Wow. And then
that's how I wound up in South Carolina on a scholarship, track scholarship at University of South Carolina.
So how did the writing come about? Were you always interested in writing, or was it just sports that you loved and you started writing, or how'd you get into the business?
I really always wanted to be a sports writer. My father weaned me on newspapers when I was a kid. We got back in those days, there were 7 newspapers in New York, and we got the New York Herald Tribune delivered to our house in the mornings. That was my father's paper of choice. Mm-hmm. And one of the great sports sections of all time was in the Herald Tribune. Some of the great writers, Red Smith was a columnist, and Tommy Holmes and Harold Rosenthal were their baseball writers, and Stanley Woodward, the legendary editor, sports editor, was the sports editor of the Herald Tribune. And then in the afternoons, I would go downtown in Oradell and I would pick up the Journal American and the World Telegram and Sun, and occasionally the Post. Mm-hmm. So I read 4 newspapers a day, and plus my father had a plumbing supply company in Hackensack, and plumbers used to come in every morning and leave copies of the Daily News on the counter there. And occasionally I got to read the Daily News, but not in my house. My father would not allow the paper in my house. He thought it was a rag, is what he described it as. And so I read it down there. But when I was down at the plumbing supply company, my father said, "You got to read Dick Young because he's the best baseball writer in New York." So I was kind of weaned on Red Smith in the morning and Dick Young at my father's store, and all the others combined.
Now, how did you get the job with UPI then, your first job?
Well, this is the classic example of it's not what you know, but who you know. I was at the University of South Carolina, and at the time, there were probably about 11 kids from the New York, New Jersey area at the time, 10 of whom were on the basketball team. Frank McGuire, the legendary coach, South basketball coach, who was the national championship coach at North Carolina, and he was known for the fact that he did almost all of his recruiting out of the New York area. They called it Frank McGuire's Underground Railway, and he did the same thing at South Carolina. And me being from the New York, New Jersey area, I was already writing a column for the school paper, and I traveled with the basketball team. So I kind of, by adoption, I became one of Frank's boys. Mm-hmm. And so it was after my senior year. I still had more credits to get. I had to go to summer school to get the last few credits for my degree. And I had that previous winter, I had run into Dana Mosley, who was a columnist, not a columnist, he was the hockey writer for the Daily News. I ran into him at a bar outside of the Garden after one of the hockey games. And I told him who I was, that I was at the University of South Carolina and I was looking to get into sports writing. And he told me not to bother writing to the New York papers, that they wouldn't hire anybody out of college. But he said you should write to the wire services because they cover the whole country and their main offices are in New York here. And, they'd be interested in a guy like you who grew up in New Jersey, went to school in South Carolina. You'd be right up their alley. And he gave me the name of a guy named Jack Griffin, who was the sports editor at UPI, United Press International. So I wrote Griffin a letter and I never heard back from him. So anyway, it's during the summer of 1970. And by then I was working for the state paper while I was finishing up the last few credits for my degree, the state paper in Columbia. And I was covering high schools and things like that for them. And I'm sitting at my desk one day at the office and the sports editor comes out of his office and he says, Billy, Frank McGuire's on the phone. He wants to talk to you. Now you got to understand, this is like a Cub reporter at the Daily News 20 years ago, and the editor comes out and says, Rudy Giuliani's on the phone. He wants to talk to you. That's how big Frank McGuire was back in South Carolina. He could have been governor. He could have been anything. So everybody's looking at me, and I said, he wants to talk to me. And he said, and Herman Helms, my boss, said, yeah, he asked for you specifically. So I get on the phone. I said, Coach, how you doing? He says, good, Billy. Look, I don't have a whole lot of time here, but I just got off the phone with Jack Griffin up in New York, and you got the job. And I
Great.
said, whoa, wait a minute. I said, Coach, I don't understand. How did you get involved in this? I didn't use you. I would have told you if I was going to use you for a reference. And he says, well, you stupid jerk. You should have used me as a reference. Don't you know that when I was coaching at St. John's, Jack Griffin was my ball boy.
Wow.
So I'm like dumbfounded now. And so Frank says to me, he says, look, Billy, you better get off the phone with me now and get on the phone with Griffin up in New York before he changes his mind. So I hang up with McGuire and I call Jack Griffin up in New York and he starts laughing at me. He says, son, do you know how many letters I have from people like you all over the country? I have a stack of about 100 on my desk here. We have an opening here. And I was going through these letters. I come across yours and it says University of South Carolina. And I looked at it and I said, well, there's only one person who's going to decide whether I give this guy a job. And that was Coach McGuire. So, and he says, I called Frank and Frank says I should hire you. So you're hired. That's how it all started.
So from there, you ended up at the Daily News then a couple of years later, right at the height of the Bronx Zoo. That must have been amazing, a local kid, and you got your job at UPI, and then you all of a sudden you're at the Daily News covering the Yankees right after they won the World Series.
Yeah, I was at UPI for 9 years, and I left UPI in 1978. Actually, I was hired in the summer of '78 by a guy named Buddy Martin. He was the sports editor at the Daily News at the time. The problem was right before I was officially supposed to be hired, the newspapers all went on strike in New York. And so I had to wait to go to the Daily News. I was kind of a lame duck at UPI because the strike didn't end until after the World Series. So I officially got hired in November of 1978 at the News. And then I started in '79 backing up Phil Pepe on the Yankee beat.
Right.
But I got a lot of time in on the Yankee beat in '79. Of course, that was a tumultuous year with Thurman
died, right?
In the plane crash, and I had to cover that. And of course, the Yankees were in turmoil all year long, having won the year before, but all kinds of things happened to them that year. And I finally started to get used to the fact that covering George Steinbrenner was a 24-hour-a-day job.
Okay, Guys Radio, my special guest, Hall of Fame sports writer, Bill Madden. We're talking about the Yankees. So tell us about Steinbrenner. You wrote 2 books, I think, about him, and just an amazing character, mercurial, kind of reminds me of Trump a little bit sometimes. What was it like being around him and covering him?
Well, it's funny you should mention Trump because they were best friends, and he is exactly like Trump. Exactly. I mean, they couldn't be it's uncanny how similar these two guys are in personality and the way they go about their business. Neither one of them ever paid their lawyers. Neither one of them ever listened to anybody. They just did things what they wanted to do. But anyway, I had a very weird relationship with George. At times, I was his favorite writer in New York. I think mainly because I worked for the paper with the biggest circulation, and he knew he could get his biggest bang for his buck by giving exclusives to the Daily News. But at the same time, we had our differences along the way as well. And when he fired Lou Piniella the second time, Lou was a very personal friend of mine. We became personal friends, and for that I could not forgive him. It's a long, involved story, but he wanted to use me by planting a story about Lou that wasn't true in the papers to justify his firing of him, and I wouldn't go along with it. And I didn't speak to him for a couple of years after that. And then he got suspended from baseball by Fay Vincent, the commissioner at the time, for what I considered to be trumped up charges about he gave money to a gambler, and Vincent tried to turn it into the fact that he broke baseball's cardinal rule about gambling in baseball. And it was a stretch to say the least. And at the same time, Vincent was getting out of control as commissioner. He called Buck Showalter and Gene Michael into his office after a game and threatened to throw them out of baseball because they didn't support him in a drug case against Steve Howe, the Yankee relief pitcher at the time. And all of this was going on. And so I started writing a series of columns about Vincent. And at the same time, they were kind of pro-George columns and pointing out the fact that he really did a number on George that I didn't think was fair at the time. And I think George saw these columns, and it was a strange thing because that's around the same time, this was during the time when baseball had a spring training strike, and they were going to use replacement players.
Right.
And it was the height of the baseball wars. And so I was down in spring training. I was down in Fort Lauderdale, and I was staying at George's hotel covering the replacement players. And I always liked staying at George's hotel. So anyway, one day I was coming up from the dining room in George's hotel, and there was a long hallway from the dining room to the lobby. And at the end of the lobby, coming towards me, is George. And as I wrote in my book about George, I said this was like a scene out of Gunsmoke. The two of us are approaching each other, and all of a sudden he yells at me. He says, "Madden, is that you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me, George." And he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, I'm covering the replacement players. I said, "I happen to like your hotel." He gets right in my face. He comes right up into my face, and I didn't know what he was going to say to me next. He looks at me and he says, "Billy, whatever happened to us?" And I never forgot that.
That's a good story.
And from that point on, we became pretty good friends. And then when he did come back to baseball, when he was reinstated, I called him up and I said, this was going to be opening day at Yankee Stadium, George's grand return. And I asked him if I could go with him to the stadium. He was staying at the Regency Hotel in Midtown. And I said, "I'd love to accompany you to the stadium and kind of go through the day with you on your first day back." I was stunned when he said I could do it. So he says, "Meet me at my hotel at 9 o'clock in the morning. Make sure you're not late." Of course, I was there by 8 o'clock. So we get in the car and we're driving up to the stadium. And it was one of my most fun columns that I wrote because our first stop was we had to stop at the ABC studios because George was invited to go on Regis and Kathy Lee, Regis Philbin and Kathy Lee. So I accompanied him on the set, and he's going back and forth with Regis and everything. And then we left there, and he gets on the phone and he calls Howard Cosell on his car phone. Cosell was dying of cancer at the time, and he was in his hotel room, and George is begging him to come to the ballpark. And he says, "Come on, Howard, it's a beautiful day. You got to come out." and Cosell is begging off. He says, "No, I'm not well enough to come to the park." And so I'm listening to this whole conversation, and then we get up to the stadium, and George starts complaining about all these old buildings around the stadium, and how it looks like a slum around the stadium. He always was complaining about it, but now he was complaining anew about these buildings. And then all of a sudden, he sees a guy standing there with a sign saying, "I need tickets." So he rolls down the window and looks at the guy and he says, "Everybody needs tickets." And the guy looks at him and says, "Oh my God, it's Steinbrenner." And with that, we went to the stadium, and now we're met at the stadium by Jack Lawn, who was the team president at the time. And Lawn, this was a tradition. George's first day at the stadium, opening day, Lawn would take him on a tour of the ballpark, and he would inspect everything to make sure everything is in order. And we go all through the ballpark, and George is looking to make sure there's no trash on the floors or any cigarette butts laying around or whatever. And now we go into one of the bathrooms upstairs on the upper level. And Lawn, without even being asked, goes into the bathroom stalls and starts flushing all the toilets.
Oh my gosh.
He comes out of the bathroom stall, and George is like half paying attention to him, and Lawn looks up. Lawn had previously worked worked for President Bush, 41, and in the cabinet. And so all of a sudden, Lawn looks up to the ceiling and says, "Forgive me, Mr. President, for what I do." And I just cracked up.
It's amazing. So you were with covering the Yankees through, well, you started end of 78. So you were there for when Munson died in 79. You had, there was still Guidry and Catfish and Nettles and Reggie. What was like versus what came in the 80s, where you had Winfield, Ricky Henderson, Mattingly? Was there like two different teams? And of course, now we can get into the 90s and the 2000s, but what was your sense as to what was going on? It was a big change when you started covering them, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, even for both eras, George was still the center of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nothing like it is today, where you walk into the clubhouse before the game today and there's nobody around. The players are all hiding in the back somewhere in their own clubhouse within the clubhouse. In those days, you'd walk into the clubhouse, and we always have to write early stories for the paper to hold room for the game story in the early editions. And as Phil Pepe once told me when he turned over the beat to me, he says, "With this team, never worry about your early. The Yankees will always provide." And by that, you would walk into that clubhouse, and on any given day, somebody had a gripe with Steinbrenner, whether it was Goose, whether it was Nettles, whether it was Mickey Rivers. There was always an issue with the Yankees. You would walk in there, and it was like nonstop shopping. You could go anybody. They were all in front of their lockers. Reggie would stick his foot out to make sure you didn't walk by his locker, because he always wanted to talk to you. And Phil was right. The Yankees always did provide. And, but it was also a trip because of the fact that, as I said to you earlier, covering Steinbrenner and covering Steinbrenner's Yankees, the Bronx Zoo Yankees, so-called, was like you were a doctor on call. You never had a free moment.
Mm-hmm.
You never knew when you're going to get a call in the middle of the night that Billy Martin's been in a car accident, or somebody popped off to one of the other papers, and you got to get Steinbrenner on the phone and whatever. It never stopped.
Okay. Bill Madden's my guest on Guys Radio. We're talking about his career covering the Yankees for the New York Daily News. Now, you mentioned Lou Piniella, and he was right in the thick of things at that time, and then he became manager. He had a couple of stints as manager, and you wrote a book about him, 50 Years of Kicking Dirt, Playing Hard, and Winning in the Sweet Spot of Baseball. What was your connection out of all those players with Lou Piniella? Sweet Lou.
Well, we just hit it off. He was, I guess it really started. I was on a Yankee charter flight to the World Series when I was just started on the beat. It was in 19. Actually, it was when I was with UPI. It was in 1977, and
he was was he on the Royals then, or the?
No, Lou was with the Yankees.
Okay.
The 77 World Series.
Okay, right, 77. Sorry. Okay.
My sports editor at UPI, Milton Richmond, was a personal friend of Steinbrenner's, and he got us, the two of us, on the Yankee charter. And I'm sitting in the back of the plane, and Lou is sitting across the aisle from me, and he's reading the Wall Street Journal. And now you got to understand, this is very unusual for a ball player. You know, you'd most likely see them reading Field and Stream or something. So anyway, he starts talking to me about stocks. He doesn't even know who I am. But I remember that, I'll never forget that. And I said, this is a different kind of player. And later, when I got on the Yankee beat, a couple of years later, he kind of remembered me. And he was one of these guys that, you know, he would always be in the hotel bar after the games and stuff. And he was one of these guys that would talk to the writers like we were part of the team. And we just really hit it off. And we later became very good friends. In fact, he lives down here in Florida, right near me here in Florida. So
what was your sense, Bill, of all the different, because there's a lot of ground to cover, and I want to do it and make them put most of your time, all the different managers you covered. You had Torre, you had Piniella, Billy Martin, Yogi, and Bob Lemon. I don't know if he was there at the same time, and Dallas Green. So what was your sense as to the different managers, their styles, and who you thought was the most effective?
Well, I was the closest with Bob Lemon. I adored Bob Lemon. He was just a wonderful man, a real man's man. In fact, in 1982, I had to talk Bob Lemon out of quitting as George's manager. The Yankees had gotten off to a bad start in 1982, and all through that spring training, George had been hammering Lemon nightly, just driving him crazy. And it was the first road trip. We were in Chicago, and Lem was taking all the writers out to dinner at Miller's Chop House in Chicago. And somehow I wound up in the same cab with Lem. And on our way to the Chop House, he says to me, he says, "Meat," he used to call everybody Meat. He says, "Meat, I got to tell you, I can't stand in here anymore. I got to get out of here. The guy's driving me crazy." And I said, "Lem, you can't do this. You can't quit because you'll never get your money. He won't pay you. You got to just stick it out, Lem. I'm begging you. You got to stick it out." And I'm saying to myself, this man has given me a scoop of scoops. He's telling me he's going to quit as Yankee manager. And here I am trying to talk him out of it. Well, as it turned out, he didn't quit. And then we got back to New York and George fired him and Lem got his money. But he was a great guy and I loved Lem. And then another one of my favorites was Dick Hauser. We only had him for 1 year in 1980. Right. But the Yankees had one of their greatest seasons under Hauser. And then, of course, Yogi was great. I'll tell you a quick funny Yogi story. We were in Cleveland, 1984, Yogi's first year, and staying at the Stouffer's Hotel in Cleveland. I went down to the coffee shop in the morning to get some breakfast, and Yogi's sitting all by himself down there. And he motions me over to sit down and join him for breakfast. So the waitress comes by. Yogi was already eating his eggs and coffee and bacon or whatever. And she said, "Can I get you something?" I said, "I'll just have an English muffin and a cup of coffee." So anyway, we had breakfast for about an hour or so. We shot the breeze and everything. Check comes. I grabbed the check and I'm looking at it. It says, I just inadvertently, I said, "Wow, $35 for breakfast." And Yogi, without batting an eye, he looks at me and he says, "Oh, it must have been the English muffin."
That's good. So you had a couple of different decades where, you went from the Bronx Zoo, then in the 80s, it was Winfield and Mattingly, and I think Righetti threw his no-hitter, but they didn't win a championship in the 80s. I think they lost to the Dodgers.
81.
81. I was at the game, 9-2. Tommy John, I think, pitched, and the Yanks lost, and that was the 6th game, I believe. I was at the stadium for that. And then you got to the 90s, and the whole thing changed again. What was your sense of when the Yankees were going to get back to to the super team that they had in the 90s?
Well, it started really when Gene Michael came in, and George was on suspension, and they needed somebody to really run the team without any interference. And that was the only reason Gene would take the job, knowing that George wasn't going to be around to interfere with everything. And once Gene came in, he started turning everything around by bringing in players who were winning type players. He knew what kind of a culture he wanted to redevelop there, and he also knew what kind of players fit that culture. And he brought in people like Steve Farr and Mike Stanley, and then he got Paul O'Neill in a trade, and you could see it all coming together. And of course, and then he brought in and he hired
Boggs, right? Too.
He hired Buck Showalter to be the manager, and it was all starting to turn. You could see it happening, and of course, George came back, but by this time he couldn't screw things up because Dina created he created a dynasty there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at the same time, through all those years, George was famous for trading away all of his top prospects for over-the-hill veterans. And Gene, of course, would have none of that. And so the farm system was able to develop, and you had Posada, you had Jeter, you had Mariano Rivera, and
right?
And Bernie Williams.
Bernie,
and all
yep.
those came into their own, along with the veterans that Stick had brought in, like Paul O'Neill.
Boggs, right? And Knobloch.
Wade Boggs, yeah. And so that's really how it all turned around. And again, George had been sufficiently neutralized. And it wasn't until after Gene left as general manager that George started interfering again, and things started to go downhill again.
Okay, so we get to the next chapter is really Jeter, and then A-Rod comes in. What was that like? What was the real dynamic there?
Well, I knew from the beginning that if they acquired it, there was rumors that they were going to get A-Rod because previous deals that he had worked out had fallen through with other teams. And then, of course, what happened, they had steadfastly tried to resist signing him because they didn't really need him at the time. And then, of course, the famous Aaron Boone off-season basketball injury, which developed as Achilles tendon, I believe it was. So now they had a desperate need for a third baseman. And even though A-Rod had been a shortstop his whole career, he jumped at the chance to go to the Yankees because the Red Sox were they were looking to unload him and get out from under his contract. Texas was, I should say.
Texas, right. And Boston was looking at signing him, right? And it was the Yankees swooped in.
So the Yankees swooped in and they signed him. Well, they didn't sign him. They made a trade for him. They traded Soriano for him. And I instinctively knew that this was not going to be a good situation because this was going to upset that great chemistry that Gene Michael had created there. Still, I mean, A-Rod was, he was a great player for them, steroids or not.
Mm-hmm.
And they did manage to win one championship with him in
2009 at Phillies, right? They beat. And then we went into the next era, which was like CC, Didi Gregorius, Chapman, Sanchez, Torres, all the guys you have now, Judge, going forward. What's your thought about what they've accomplished and what they could accomplish, and what's your prospects for 2021 for the Yanks?
I don't know. The Yankees are, they've got a lot of issues with this team right now. I am assuming they're going to re-sign LeMahieu at some point. I think right now the entire free agent market is kind of really, certainly for the big names and the big money guys, it's frozen because none of these teams know what time the season, when the season is going to start, whether they're not going to have fans in the seat. There's so much cost uncertainty that I don't see any of these guys signing maybe for another month or so until we have some idea of when the season's going to start. Otherwise, I think the Yankees are getting a break because they're in a very weak division, the American League East, which got weaker with Tampa Bay trading
Snell, right?
Like Snell and letting Charlie Morton go. So they're not going to have a whole lot of competition, but at the same time, the Yankees pitching staff is very problematic after Cole.
Cole, right.
The only sure thing they got in their rotation. So I think they're going to probably win the division out of, by process of elimination, but I don't know how far they're going to go after that.
Okay. Last question about the Yankees, because I want to talk about the Seaver book. Who was the greatest Yankee you covered? And what was the greatest Yankee moment and the greatest Yankee game you covered? That's a 3-4 for you, Bill.
Okay. I got to think about this.
Player, moment, and game.
Greatest Yankee player I covered. Well, I guess I'd have to say Jeter.
Mm-hmm.
But for a short period of time, there was nobody greater than Don Mattingly.
Yep.
He was special in those 5 years that he put in there until he got hurt.
Hall of Fame for him? Think he belongs?
Unfortunately, he didn't do enough. I voted for Donnie in his last year on the ballot because just in case he made a huge jump, I didn't want to be the guy that cost him the one vote he needed to get elected. He never came close, but
Okay.
but he was a special player.
Greatest Yankee moment that you covered?
I would probably say the 78 playoff game, the Bucky Dent game.
Mhm.
I was with UPI at the time. I was the lead baseball writer for UPI. And,
The homer off of Torres, right, up in Boston?
Yeah. I would have to say that was because it was such a great game.
Yeah.
It was just riveting, that game. There were so many aspects of that game that, you forget about it.
Let's turn the page. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Bill.
I remember them all when I did the book with Lou.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's amazing history, amazing team, and you did such a wonderful job. I read you for years, and all my friends, we all read you forever, and thank you for all that wonderful work. Let's switch to Tom Seaver because, you covered the Yankees for so long, yet you wrote this beautiful book. It just came out called Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life, and he's a really interesting guy. And as a Yankee reporter, what was your connection with Tom Seaver, and how'd you end up writing this wonderful, very heartfelt book?
Well, I guess my relationship with him really started in 1984, in January of 1984. I had been covering the Yankees, of course, and I didn't spend too much time on the Mets, around the Mets, but I would see Seaver in the off season at banquets and things like that. And he knew who I was because I was usually on the back page of the Daily News quite often because
Right.
Steinbrenner and Yankees and everything. So he certainly knew who I was. And in January of 1984, baseball had something called the free agent compensation draft, in which this was a product of the end product of the 1981 labor strike, in which they had to come up with some sort of system to compensate teams indirectly who had lost free agent players. And they came up with this idea that every team in baseball could protect 15 players out of their entire organization, and the rest of the players would go into this pool. And teams who lost free agents could pick out of this pool. So it wasn't directly from the team that took their player. It was indirectly. And I got a call one day, a couple of days before the draft, and from a friend of mine who worked in the commissioner's office. And he asked me, he says, "Are you writing anything about the draft tomorrow?" And I said, it was actually 2 days later. And I said, "I don't know. It's not really a New York story because neither the Yankees or the Mets lost any free agents. So I don't know what I'm going to be writing about." He says, "Well, I have a feeling you're going to be writing a lot about it because it is a New York story." I said, "Why are you saying that?" And he said, "Because I'm sitting here looking at the draft list and you'll never guess who the Mets have left unprotected on their list." And I said, "Who?" He said, "Seaver."
Wow.
I said, "Seaver, you're kidding me." And so what happened was, and he says, "And not only that, but I called the White Sox. They had the first pick in the draft. And this guy happened to be a White Sox fan. And he called the White Sox and he said, the White Sox confirmed to me they're going to take him on Friday." I said, "Oh my God, what a story this is." So now I'm sitting on what is probably the biggest story I ever broke at the Daily News. I had to call Frank Cashin, the general manager of the Mets, to get a confirmation on it. And Cashin, I got him on the phone and I told him what I knew. And he said, "Well, Billy, I'm not going to lie to you. We did leave him unprotected, but he's a 39-year-old pitcher. We didn't think anybody would take him." And I said, "Well, Frank, I hate to tell you this, but I have a good information that the White Sox are going to take him on Friday. So now there's a silence on the phone, and Frank says to me, he says, well, you got to write what you got to write, and I guess I'll deal with it when it happens. So now I'm sitting on this story, and I could never do this today. You got to understand, in this modern day of cell phones and
Right.
Twitter and Facebook and internet
Exactly.
and everything else, no story is sacred for more than 2 seconds. So, but in those days, none of those things existed, and you could sit on paper, you could sit on a story throughout the day. And what we did, we held it out of the paper until the last edition. At the same time, I felt I had an obligation to Seaver. I didn't want to blindside this guy. The next day, he was going to have to leave the Mets for the second time in his career and uproot his family and have to go to Chicago, a new team in a new league, designated hit, all of this stuff. This was a traumatic event in his life. So I called him and I told him what was going on. And I said, I just wanted to let you know what is happening here. I didn't want you to be blindsided tomorrow in the paper. And he was very appreciative of the fact that I would make the effort to call him and basically tell him what was going to happen. And from that day on, I think he looked at me as more than just another sports writer. And we became friends. And ironically, 2 years later, of course, he came back and won his 300th game at, of all places, Yankee Stadium.
That's right.
In 1985. And then in 86, he was in the final year of his contract with the White Sox. And he wasn't doing that well, and the White Sox weren't doing that well. And he wanted to get home to New York and get back home. And he asked Ken Harrelson, the general manager of the White Sox, to see if he could trade him to the Mets, see if the Mets were interested. Well, this was 86 now, and the Mets were on their way to the World Series.
Right.
They had Darling and the Gooden and Sid Fernandez and Ojeda. They had no need, and Davey Johnson wanted no part of bringing Seaver in to his pitching staff. So that went nowhere. And so Seaver calls me and he said, I need a favor from you. And I said, what's that? He says, I need to get back to New York. I miss my family and I'm going nowhere out here in Chicago. I'm lonely and this is a waste of my time out here. I need to get back to New York. Would you call Steinbrenner for me? I said,
Wow.
I said, well, I guess so. I said, what do you want me to tell him? He says, just tell him I'd love to end my career with the Yankees. And if he could work out a deal, I would be very grateful. So I told him, I said, well, you know what, Tom? I said, this is right up Steinbrenner's. This is right out of his playbook to upstage the Mets, who have taken over the town, going to the World Series this year. And this great team they've got over there. They've really taken all the attention away from he could acquire Tom Seaver, bring him back to New York for the third time as a Yankee. I said, I can't imagine he won't be up for this. So I called George, and I was truly surprised that he was only lukewarm to the idea. And he said, I don't know. I got to think about this, Billy. And then I called Hawk Harrelson, the White Sox general manager. I said, well, I've talked to George. I think he'll still do this, but he was kind of lukewarm to the idea. So Harrelson calls me back and he said, after talking to George, and he says, George is all hung up over this shortstop prospect that we have to have in this deal. His name was Carlos Martinez. He was a 6'6" shortstop. And he was a prospect at the time. So he says, you got to talk to Steinbrenner and tell him he's got to do this deal, but we've got to have Martinez in the deal. So here, I called George back. I said, I can't believe I'm in the middle of this.
You're like general manager, right?
Trade conversation. So George says, I can't give up this kid. I said, George, we're talking about Tom Seaver here. And you're hung up over some shortstop who the scouts all tell me he's too big to play shortstop. He'll never play shortstop in the big leagues. Come on, George, you got to do this. So anyway, he wouldn't do the deal. Harrelson called me back later in the day and he said, George will not budge on Martinez, so I'm trading Seaver to the Red Sox. Right. And that's what happened. And but again, we were that kind of friends at the time that Seaver would call me and see if I could work out a deal to get him to the Yankees.
Well, it's a great book. I love the fact that Seaver says, pitching's about velocity, location and ball movement. And there's a little incident in there where he's not pitching well. And the manager comes out and says, you don't have anything. You don't have the velocity. He says, yeah, but I got the location and the ball movement. What's your sense of how Seaver was the consummate pitcher? Was he the ultimate pitcher that you covered in your writing career? Was he the best?
He was the most intelligent player I covered as a,
Mm-hmm.
as a writer. He was the smartest player I ever knew. And of course, it epitomized the way he approached pitching. As he said to me on many occasions, I was an artist out there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was Tom Hume of the Reds. He was a reliever for the Reds when Seaver was over there. He was their closer, actually. And he was a young kid, born and raised in Cincinnati, not very worldly until Seaver came over there. He followed Seaver around like a puppy. Seaver would take him out to museums. And as Tom Hume told me, he says, he really taught me culture. He taught me so much about everything, especially pitching. He said, the thing I will always remember with Tom, the way Tom approached pitching, he was always 2 pitches ahead, thinking 2 pitches ahead on every batter. And
Amazing.
the classic example of that was a story I got from Tony La Russa. They were playing a game. I forget who they were playing against, but it was late in the game, and Seaver was starting to tire a little bit, and there was a runner on third base, and there was 2 outs, and a dangerous left-handed hitter is coming up to bat. La Russa's got a left-handed reliever in the bullpen. He starts to walk to the mound, and Seaver waves him off. He says, no, don't worry about it. I got this guy. So La Russa makes an about face. He starts walking back to the dugout, and Seaver yells at him, but just so you know, I'm going to fall behind in the count, and then I'm going to get him to pop up to third base. So La Russa shakes his head. He goes back to the dugout. Sure enough, Seaver falls behind 2-0. The batter is digging in now, looking for that fastball. And he throws him a changeup, and he pops it up to the third baseman. Seaver walks up the mound, and he winks at La Russa.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Bill Madden, my special guest on Guys Radio. I got to tell you, the book, Tom Seaver, A Terrific Life, is one of your best, and just your contribution to sports. And as a Yankees fan and a long time, individual growing up in Bergen County and then New York City, following your column for many, many years, me, along with so many of my buddies, we say thank you for doing the wonderful work you did. And I'm really pleased that you came on my show, Guys Radio, and you're a real guys guy, and I'm very appreciative. So thank you, Bill Madden. Let everybody know where they can find out more about you or get your book or whatever you want to share.
Well, it's available in all good bookstores, and it's available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble websites. And Costco has got a bunch of them. It's all around.
Fantastic. And I hope there's more to come.
Well, we'll see about that.
And in the interim, enjoy Florida, and thank you so much. Happy New Year to you. Thanks so much, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.